Armin laughed into the phone and bit his sandwich. He told his little sister not to worry and that he would be home by evening. The street smelled like rain and fried bread. A lamp blinked near the bus stop and a cat slipped through shadow. He checked the time and breathed out. The world felt ordinary until a thin cold touched his skin and the city sound faded as if someone closed a door. The sandwich dropped from his hand and the phone slipped from his ear. For one long heartbeat everything went thin and distant and he felt as if he had been moved like a piece on a board. He opened his eyes to a ceiling that hummed and walls that curved like the inside of a shell. White light pooled without a source. Metal shapes moved with a slow, patient rhythm. He lay on a narrow table and straps sat loose around his wrists. Faces leaned in, not with hate but with the calm of someone watching a small animal. Fear rose like a tide. He said his sister's name and the sound came out thin. A hand with 3 long fingers and soft pads rested on his wrist. The touch was warm and steady. The pounding of his heart slowed a little. They did not shout or threaten. They did not speak his words. They made clicking noises and held up small devices that painted lights in the air. One of them showed him a small box with an image that looked like his own street. The box showed a woman waving. He tried to say, "She is my sister," and only managed a broken whisper. They fed him without words. The food was soft and tasted of something like bread and honey, but cleaner. He ate slowly because his body needed it. They watched him as if watching a plant grow. They taught him small tasks. He learned to hold a thin tool and place a tiny chip into a humming panel. He learned to clean a lens without leaving a print. The work had a rhythm that calmed his hands. Still, at night, when the hum turned lower, he called his sister in his mind and felt a hollow ache. Days passed in a way that made time feel strange. The ship had rooms where people worked and quiet rooms where metal windows looked into corridors filled with lights. He walked those halls with a thin badge on his shirt that said only short lines and a small number. The badge felt heavy because it meant attention. One day they brought him into a long hall where many sat and ate. The table was wide and the people around it had pale skins and eyes that circled like moons. He sat at the edge and watched them move like a crowd of slow birds. A small child figure peeked at him with big eyes, and the child reached out. Armin remembered his sister's small fingers and he took the child's hand without thinking. The touch was balmy and the child's breath smelled sweet like a flower. Then someone tapped a screen and the test began. Machines clicked above their heads. The room watched his hands as he picked up tools and followed commands. His fingers were earth-rough and clumsy with their shapes. A machine flashed red and a small alarm sounded. He froze, expecting scorn. An older worker beside him slid a tiny instrument and showed him a softer way to hold it. He copied the movement and the machine settled. A few heads turned and a slow murmur passed through the hall. Later, while he carried a tray, he saw a worker fall. The worker lay with a twisted arm and dark fluid spread beneath like a bruise. Without thinking, Armin set the tray down and knelt. He wrapped a soft strip around the arm and held the worker's head while 2 nurse-like figures stitched and cleaned. He spoke no words, his hands spoke. The worker's breathing steadied. The people who watched shifted. They had seen tests and numbers and efficiency, but not this small human quickness that used no instruments and moved with an illness of kindness that did not match their own rules. A manager came forward. He had a smooth face and wore more thin badges than others. He tapped a tablet and numbers flowed like a small river. He studied Armin as if reading a page. Then he placed his own hand near Armin's chest and made a tone that meant approval. Armin's chest tightened. He felt a hot, strange pride. They pinned a new badge to his shirt that night. It had sharper lines and a fresher number. He slept with it under his pillow and dreamed of the bakery window and his sister's small laugh. The new badge brought attention. People who had only glanced now watched him more closely. He answered small questions with short words and learned how to change filters and how to measure humming energy. He made mistakes and was helped. He learned to hold delicate things without crushing them and to stand in silence when the ship sang its low songs. Hope and fear braided inside him like two hands bound together. Then a message ran across a large screen in the main room. Officials moved like cold birds and the word recall blinked in the corner. Images from a distant place scrolled streets, cars, faces that might be his own. Armin's throat closed. He wanted to scream his sister's name until his voice broke and the ship shook. He wanted home. At the same time a soft voice in the room said something about assignment and bridge and liaison. The manager who had touched his shirt looked at him with an odd mixture of respect and careful distance. He tapped the tablet and pointed to Armin's badge, then to a long line of symbols that meant travel and decision. Armin stood very still with the new badge heavy against his chest. He thought of his sister and the small hand that reached for the child figure. He thought of the worker whose arm he had held and the nurse who had mouthed a word that felt like thanks. He did not know the meaning of promotion here, only that it held both danger and a strange hope. The light above flicked once like the lamp that had blinked in his street, and the hum of the ship sounded like a distant city. He pressed his palm to the badge and whispered his sister's name into the steel air. Armin walked into the great eating hall and felt very small. The room was wider than any shop back home and filled with long tables and soft humming lights. Hundreds of workers sat in quiet rows and ate with careful hands. The air smelled of warm steam and something sweet he could not name. He kept the new badge tight against his shirt. It felt like a coin that could roll and fall at any moment. He found a place at the edge and watched. A child from the other day looked up and waved with slow fingers. The child's eyes were round and curious. Armin reached out and took the small hand without thinking. The child's grip was sharp and trusting. For a moment the clatter of metal and the low hum turned into a small human sound, the echo of his sister's laugh inside his head. He felt less alone. Then an alarm clicked like a small bell and a test began. Machines above them blinked and a line of lights traced a path on the table. A screen floated and showed a pattern he had not learned. His palms went a little sweaty. He picked up a thin tool and tried to follow. The tool was not like the tools back home. It fit between fingers that were longer and colder. He fumbled and the machine flashed orange. People glanced. He wanted to sink into the table and disappear. An older worker beside him moved a little closer and tapped the tool with a practiced motion. The motion was simple and small. He watched and copied, and the machine settled. A murmur passed like a soft wind through the hall. Later, while carrying a tray of warm packets, Armin heard a sharp thud and a sound like a broken bell. A worker had collapsed and lay with a pale face and a thin arm at a wrong angle. People in the hall froze in the neat way they always had frozen at mild alarms. Armin felt the old fear edge into his chest, the fear of being watched and judged. He dropped the tray and kneeled. He had no titles and no training, but he had hands that knew how to fold cloth and press bread into a wrapper for his sister. He wrapped a soft strip he found on the tray around the worker's arm and held the head steady. He whispered nothing because they did not have his words. His hands moved with small human logic. Nearby, nurse figures came and worked with tools that sang. The worker's breathing smoothed and the eyes opened like a curtain. The hall watched. The manager who had given him the first badge moved through the crowd. He had many thin badges across his chest and a face that showed the smooth control of the ship. He stopped and looked at Armin with new attention. He placed a pale hand over Armin's wrapped palm and made a low tone that meant something like approval. For the first time since the lamp blinked outside the city, Armin felt pride that did not hurt. That evening, word spread. Simple workers who had only seen numbers now spoke in quiet cliques and passed him small gifts, a soft cloth to clean lenses, a piece of fruit that tasted bright like sun. He learned small things quickly. He learned how to hold a lens with two hands so it would not shiver. He learned how to read a small glowing panel and follow its slow logic. He learned the polite silence that kept large machines from thinking him messy. People began to ask him to show them how he had steadied the fallen worker. He showed them the way his hands had folded the strip and how he had murmured nothing but kept breathing steady. They watched the small human habits like a new kind of science. A week passed and Armin's badge felt heavier. He slept with his hand over it and dreamed of the bus stop and the smell of fried bread. He missed his sister until a pain sat under his ribs and would not leave. One night the manager called him to a small room that smelled of old oil and warm light. The manager's many thin badges clicked softly as he moved. He tapped a tablet and images flowed, maps, lines of tiny symbols, a row of faces that looked to him like officers. The manager's face was unreadable. Then he pointed to a symbol on the tablet and then to Armin's badge. The symbol showed the shape of a bridge, a thing to cross from one place to another. The manager spoke one slow word that Armin had not heard often, liaison. Armin's mouth went dry. The manager tapped again and English letters formed on the tablet in a careful font, field liaison. Armin had never thought a badge could change the shape of his life. A rush of cold and hot mixed in his chest. The manager said little more, but his tone carried weight. He said that a team would leave at dawn and that Armin must lead it. Lead. The word knocked like a small stone in Armin's stomach. He had barely learned to hold a thin tool without dropping it. He had no training in orders or plans. He imagined standing before a line of workers who expected him to know more than he did. He imagined telling his sister that he must stay because the ship wanted him to fix things for them. He imagined her thin face and the slow way she would blink, trying to understand. The manager watched him with patient eyes and then tapped the tablet to show a short clip, a field outside the ship, wild and bright, with small structures and many faces that looked unsure. He said the mission was simple: go, learn, show them a human way of small kindness, and report back. Armin felt both terror and a trembling thread of hope. If he could teach one a way of small care, maybe fewer hands would break and fewer children would cry. Maybe someone would remember his sister. But the manager closed the tablet and added one more thing. The ship had received a message from a distant world, a single word that meant danger and change. The manager's voice was low: recall. Armin's throat tightened. He asked the manager if he could go home first. The manager only tapped the tablet and showed two paths, one that went back to Earth alone, and one that took him outward with the team and a chance to change more than one room on the ship. The manager said the team would leave at dawn. Armin walked out into the hall where plates glowed and children hummed. His badge flashed a small light and the word under it read Field Liaison in tidy letters. He pressed his palm to the metal and thought of his sister smiling at the window. He did not know what decision would follow or where the dawn would take him. The hall hummed like a waiting heart and a small child leaned into him and sang a sound that felt like a promise. Armin woke to the ship's soft hum and the thin light that slid under the door like a quiet promise. He put his hand on the badge and felt its weight there. The new title moved through him like a small tide. Today he would walk with others and learn the rules that kept the ship in order. The hall smelled of warm metal and oil and something like bread left too long under heat. He followed a line of workers with thin badges and moved like a shadow in a crowd that did not speak. The rules were small and many. Keep your hands clean. Do not whistle near the vents. Never touch containment doors. Speak only when addressed. Watch the screens and answer in tones that matched the panels. Sometimes the rules made sense. Sometimes they felt sharp and strange, like a cold wind that cut without leaving a mark. He learned how to fold a filter and how to read a meter that breathed light. He learned the soft clicks that meant all clear and the short sounds that meant wait. Each new action steadied him. He felt less like a wild thing and more like a place in the ship's great machine. Yet the rules also made him nervous. They were like fences that kept people small and safe in one way and small and lonely in another. He watched the workers move with perfect little motions and felt the space between them and himself. The child who had once reached for his hand followed him sometimes and watched him with round eyes, as if learning how to be human by watching someone else. One day he walked near a section with thick doors and a sign that pulsed a pale blue. A guard with a soft face but hard eyes tapped his wrist and spoke a tone that meant stay back. The guard's hands were gentle but his stance was rigid like a rod of law. Armin remembered the rule about containment doors and nodded. The child reached for a small toy at his feet and he smiled and tapped the air to make a soft sound. It was then he heard a small cry from behind the doors, like a thin thread of song knotted in fear. He stepped closer even though the guard's tone tightened. The cry was a small sound that seemed to mean alone. He could not tell what waited behind the door. He saw only a dark shape move like a child and then the light blinked away. Later that day, at his station, an alarm rang, a thin bell. A technician came running and his face showed a strange mix of hurry and worry. He told Armin in clicks and tones that a subject in containment had begun to show signs of distress. The words translated into a map in Armin's head. The sign had pulsed where he had heard the cry. The rule in his chest said go nowhere near. His hands shook with the two pulls inside him. One pull was the ship's voice calling for strict order. The other pull was the small voice that had lived in his home since childhood that said help first, ask later. He rose and followed the technician against the clean rules. The corridors smelled of ozone and warm metal and the hum of servos. He saw doors with warning lights and cameras that watched like round eyes. He felt watched and small, but the memory of the cry tightened his steps. When the team opened a small hatch, the light spilled and a creature curled inside. It was small and pale and shivered like a wet thing. Its eyes were bright and too big for its face. Instruments clicked and a scientist moved to take measurements with a tool that hummed. The scientist's motions were precise and cool. The chart said test, check, log, then move on. The creature trembled in a way that felt like memory to Armin. It made a small noise that touched a place in his chest he had thought closed. He acted before the rules could settle in his mind. He stepped forward and reached out. The scientist froze and a camera turned toward him in a slow spin. Someone shouted a tone that meant stop. Armin's fingers closed around the creature's small shoulder and he lifted it like a father would lift a child from a cold floor. He wrapped his jacket around it because the creature's skin was thin. He hummed a small tune his mother used to sing when rain came. The sound was nothing special, only a ladder of notes that meant safe. The creature's breath slowed and it curled into his arms like a thing that had been waiting for a human touch. The scientist's eyes widened and the machine clicked a warning. Rules flashed in Armin's mind in a red chorus. He had broken a rule. He had touched containment. He had moved a subject without orders. For a moment he felt a paralyzing fear that the ship would strip him of the small respect he had earned. But then he felt the warmth of the creature's breath on his cheek and the scent of something like soft grass. The human part of him held fast to that warmth. A small guard came and the team leader shouted a string of tones that meant explanation and reprimand. Armin did not speak with words, only with the calm of his hands. The creature hummed the song again, the same notes he had made, and its tiny face relaxed into something like trust. The team leader listened in a way others had not. He watched the way the creature's breath slowed and the way the machine's reading smoothed. Numbers that had jumped settled back into a steady line. The scientist frowned and wrote notes. He clicked his device and replayed the pattern of the creature's vitals. The data showed something the ship's rules had not expected. The creature responded to human touch and to small tunes with a drop in stress that no instrument had predicted. The team leader tapped the tablet and his face softened a degree. In a low tone he said something that Armin did not fully understand, but which sounded like a word that could mean interesting or danger. Armin felt a rare spark of approval, but also the cold breath of danger. He had broken a rule and the ship had noticed. Later that night the manager called him into a room that smelled of warm oil and paper-thin light. The manager's many badges caught the glow like small moons. He did not shout. He tapped a tablet and showed lines that moved like ladders. He pointed to the containment file and then to a column that had the creature's reading. The manager's face was a careful mask. He said the ship would look into the breach. He said that compliance was necessary for order. Then he paused and his eyes met Armin's. In that look Armin saw a question and maybe a small respect. Outside in the dark corridor, an alarm began to sound in a far-off wing. A tone ran across the ship like a distant bird. The manager stood. He closed the tablet and tapped a device that made the door seal. The manager's hand moved quick and there was a new line on Armin's badge, a tiny symbol that Armin could not read. He swallowed and the ship's hum felt suddenly heavy. The manager said nothing more than, "Wait." Armin stood very still with the creature's small warmth in his mind and the rule of doors ringing in his head. He had learned their rules, and he had broken the most important one. Now the ship watched him as it watched all strange things. The alarms grew louder down the corridor like a small storm moving fast. Red lights flashed and the clean hum of the ship changed into a hard, busy sound. Armin kept the small creature wrapped in his jacket close to his chest. It fit there like something scared and warm. He moved with a team that wore tense faces and scanned every doorway. Cameras turned their round eyes toward him and he felt their attention as a pull at the back of his neck. The guard who had warned him before walked beside him, slower now, his jaw tight. The child who had followed sometimes pressed a small hand into Armin's sleeve and whispered a sound that meant watch. They moved through halls that smelled of hot wire and warm oil. People stepped aside when they saw Armin's badge. He felt both shame and a strange pride because the badge now meant others looked to him to not break the ship's order. A door hissed open and light spilled like a slice of day. In the middle of the room, machines worked with a steady rhythm. Workers hovered at panels. A long conduit ran across the ceiling and pulsed with a yellow light. Suddenly the conduit snapped with a loud tear. Sparks jumped like angry beetles and a hot stream of white fluid sprayed across the floor. Someone screamed a thin, shocked sound. The nearest worker froze with a spatter on his sleeve. The fluid hissed and the machine beside him shuddered. A panel overheated and thin smoke curled. The room moved into a ballet of trained motions. Hands found tools, tones called for shut down, arms lifted. But the worker nearest the spill had his arm trapped under a fallen beam. His breathing came fast and shallow. The team around him argued in quick tones about protocols and safe distances. If they left him, the fluid would burn further. If they tried a normal extraction, the machine would lock down and many would be injured. Armin's heart kicked hard. He could see the worker's face lines like a map and eyes that blinked at him with fear. He did not wait for permission. He ran. He grabbed a loose strip of metal and a soft packet that had been on a tray nearby, leftover food wrapped in thin paper. He pressed the paper to the burn where the fluid hit and folded the metal into a small clamp. He had no training, but he had hands that fixed things on the fly, folded cardboard into a funnel back home, tied a ripped shoe with string. He wrapped the makeshift clamp around the worker's arm, pressed the paper to stop the burn from seeping, and whispered a nonsense story his sister used to tell when thunder came. The worker breathed a slow sound and the machine's sensors, confused by the human patch, registered less damage. The team leader shouted and then paused, watching the numbers on his display. The conduit's spray slowed because the clamp shifted the flow. Someone else ran to secure the beam and pull the arm free. The worker's breath steadied. For a moment the room was only the sound of the worker breathing and Armin's heavy inhale. The people around him touched the patch and the paper as if it were holy. The manager who had given him the first badge emerged from the doorway. He had watched the whole scene like a judge waiting to see a play's ending. He did not shout. He walked to Armin and placed a hand on his shoulder. The hand was warmer than Armin expected. The manager looked at the makeshift clamp, at the paper, at the worker, and then at Armin's face. He made a low tone and the team leader repeated it, an odd sound that in the ship meant gratitude. The manager's eyes, which had been careful before, softened. He lifted his palm and tapped Armin's badge. A tiny light on the badge blinked like a small star. Armin felt the warmth of the manager's thanks as if it were a small coin put in his shirt pocket. Later, when the smoke cleared and the conduit was sealed, the manager led Armin to a narrow room that smelled of warm metal and old paper. He did not smile. He tapped a tablet and images flowed across like a small river, the worker's vitals, the clamp's odd readings, the slowed spread of the fluid. The data looked like a code only they would read. He pointed to a line that rose and then fell and then rose again, numbers that meant danger avoided. Then he spoke a few words in the slow way he used with things that mattered. He said that what Armin had done was not in any manual. He said the ship learned from outcomes, and that humans put their hands where instruments would not. He said, in short, you gave us quickness. Armin's chest filled and emptied in a wave. He had wanted to help because he could not stand someone in pain. He had not thought of being praised. The manager tapped the tablet and a new window opened. The light showed a distant point of blue with small dark lines, an image that made Armin's throat close. It was a place like the view he had seen on the small box the day he woke, a street, a bus, a window with a laughing face. The manager spoke one careful word that felt like a small stone dropped into the ship's water: recall. The word hung in the room and made the hum shiver. Armin's breath stopped. The manager did not explain. He only said that a message had arrived from far away and that it meant choices and movement. He tapped another symbol and the tablet showed two paths, one that bent toward the bright blue dot and one that pointed outward to fields and other small worlds. The manager's face was unreadable, but his fingers brushed Armin's shoulder like an offer and a warning. "We owe you," he said in the low voice, and then he added, "we must also obey." Armin pressed his palm to the badge and felt the tiny light under his skin. The creature he had saved curled in his mind like a small promise. The worker he had held had opened his eyes and smiled in a way that made Armin's chest ache. Outside the narrow room, the ship sang its low song and somewhere deep a bell rang like a door in the rain. The manager closed the tablet and the door side shut. Armin stood alone with the weight of two worlds pressing at his ribs, one that wanted him to cross a bridge, and one that might call him back. He did not yet know which way he would turn. Armin woke to a louder hum. The ship moved like a beast turning in sleep. Word had spread quickly. People he had helped stood with him in small groups. They did not speak his language, but their faces showed the same quiet hope he felt. The manager who first touched his shirt walked beside him. The child who liked his hand walked close and clasped his finger. The badge at his chest warmed like a small ember. A message had come from far away. It showed a bright blue dot and then a shape he knew without knowing why: a street corner, a bus stop, a bakery window. For a moment the room smelled like fried bread and rain. His sister's laugh rose in his memory. He imagined her in the window, waiting. The image flickered to a live feed. A small face waved. Armin's mouth went dry. His breath hitched. The captain called a meeting. The council filled a wide room with high seats and thin lights. Armin sat on a simple chair in the middle like a thing placed on a stage. The captain's voice was low but clear. Through a device that showed words, the captain explained the ship's problem. Some worlds sent warning signs. Some species behaved in ways that could harm many. The ship must classify planets to keep balance. Earth's image on their screens was a bright blue with many sharp points. A single word came again from the distant message: recall. Armin felt the word like a push. Recall meant change. It meant he might go home alone and never return. It meant he might be taken for study and never see his sister again. It meant his name could be closed in a file. The captain's face did not show softness. It showed weight and a careful line of duty. He said the ship must obey the message. The manager who had put the new badge on Armin's chest stepped forward and made a quiet tone. He said the humans did things their machines did not predict. He placed on the table a document with a list of choices and a stylus that would seal a decision. Outside the window the ship's engines hummed like a risk. Inside, Armin heard only the small sound of his heart and the muffled breathing of the child at his side. Hands he had touched before: workers, nurses, the guard who once warned him shifted closer. The scientist who had scolded him earlier stood with a tablet tucked under his arm. They had all watched him break rules and save lives. Now they looked at him as if he could pull a thread that changed more than one stitch. The stylus felt strange in Armin's fingers. The paper had two columns. One column led toward home. It promised a short ride and a return to lonely rooms and a small life with the memory of ship lights. The other column pointed elsewhere. It promised time, work, risk, and the chance to teach people who had never known what a small kindness could change. It promised that he might make rules softer for others captured like him. It promised that he might never hold his sister again. Armin thought of the times he had shared his sandwich with a street dog, of the lullaby he hummed that calmed the small creature, of the worker whose arm he had clamped with paper and metal. He thought of the child who wrapped his small fingers around his hand. He felt a deep pull between two loves, the fierce, home-sore love for his sister and the new, burning love for the lives he could change on the ship and beyond. His hand trembled. He closed his eyes and pictured the bakery window. He pictured the small face on the screen waving. He felt a hot salt in his throat. He also pictured the pale creature curled in a small room, eyes too big for its face, and the way its breathing steadied when he hummed. He pictured the nurse who touched his patched hand and smiled in a language he did not know. He opened his eyes and saw the faces around him. They did not demand. They offered. The captain waited. The manager tapped the tablet. The stylus hovered over the paper. Armin placed his palm on the badge and pressed the stylus down with a slow breath. He did not sign without thought. He thought of both worlds and how small things could grow. He read the line and felt the weight of a choice that would bend many lives. He lifted the stylus and marked the box that would send him outward with a team. He chose the harder road. The room held its breath like the sky before rain. Some faces shone with relief. Others closed like shells. Outside, the live feed blinked and the small face on the screen stopped waving. For one long second Armin felt as if the ship and his home both waited for his next move. A soft chime sounded. The captain said the ship would prepare. The manager stepped forward and placed his hand on Armin's shoulder in a quiet way that meant dead. The child squeezed Armin's finger and hummed the same simple tune he had taught it. A message came through the feed one more time. The image was close up now, his sister's face filling the frame, eyes bright and confused. She mouthed words he could not hear. Her lips moved, and for a moment hope burned like a small flame. Armin closed his eyes. He let the taste of bread and the ship's metal air mix in his mouth. He thought of the promise he had made to himself the first night he woke on the table, to live, to carry memory like a lamp. The room dimmed as people moved to prepare. The ship's hum deepened. Armin stood and stepped toward the door that would lead him away from the bright blue dot and toward the unknown fields. Behind him, someone pressed a small recorder into the manager's hand. The recorder blinked red. The manager played it and a thin, clear voice, Armin's voice, said only one simple line that could travel home: "I am okay. Keep laughing." The words hung in the air like a seed. As the door sealed behind him, the feed showed his sister's face one last time. Her eyes were full of a question he could not answer. The screen went dark. Outside, the ship folded space like a page. Inside, Armin's heart beat in a rhythm that mixed loss and fierce hope. He had chosen. Now the ship carried his choice toward the edge of something new. The council room smelled of warm metal and old paper. Armin sat with his badge heavy on his chest. Around him the council of thin-faced elders listened as he spoke in small, careful words. He did not have a long speech prepared. He had only the things he knew: the taste of bread he loved, the sound of his sister's laugh, the way a small hand fit into his. He told them about the sandwich he ate the night he vanished, about the little songs his mother hummed, about a worker whose arm he fixed with paper and a clamp made in a hurry. He spoke slowly so the device in front of him could show translation. Faces around the room shifted like slow stones. Some eyes were soft. Others were flat like glass. He felt the weight of a planet and the weight of the ship press against him both at once. The captain listened with a face that meant duty. The manager who had first given him a badge watched with a hand that tapped a tablet now and then. The child who had followed him sat near the door and hummed a small tune under its breath. When he finished, Armin did not demand mercy or promise miracles. He only said one simple thing: small hands can change big things. He said that when someone cares for another, machines learn to measure different numbers. The room held its breath like a sky before rain. The council whispered in tones that clicked across the devices. They showed charts and memories of the ship's history, times when orders protected many and times when strict law broke small lives. The captain spoke of duty and the risk of letting feelings shape policy. He told a story of a world that had been harmed because one group of workers followed only feeling and ignored data. The room flickered with images of broken places. Then the manager who had touched Armin's chest stood and made a slow tone. He told the room about a worker who had been saved by a human's quick hands. He showed the data that the scientist had logged when the creature's vitals calmed at Armin's hum. He said humans introduced a variable they did not understand, and perhaps that variable could be shaped into a protective thing. The elder at the head of the table tapped his device and the vote began. Armin watched faces turn toward him. He thought of the bright blue dot that was home and of the small live feed he had seen before he left. He thought of the sister who might be waiting at the window. He felt a sharp cold that was almost pain. The vote rolled like a slow tide. Some councils feared humanity's unknown. Some saw chance. The numbers moved until a final tone sounded. The council's decision echoed in the room: they would not return him alone. They would not seal Earth behind a wall of files. Instead they offered a new role, one the ship had not had before. They called it Bridge Liaison. Armin would stand between worlds. He would travel to other worlds with teams. He would teach small acts of care and learn how machines might hold them. He would help write rules that measured kindness. He would have power to change policy, to slow the quick hands of a bad law, and to teach cautious hearts to feel. The manager placed another badge on Armin's chest. This badge was not only a number. It had lines like a bridge. He felt the metal cool and then warm. The child at the door laughed a tiny sound and the child's eyes shone. The captain's face stayed steady but softer. Armin felt both pride and a hollow pain open inside. He knew what the role could mean. It could mean fewer doors slammed on small creatures. It could mean more people living who would otherwise be logged and forgotten. It could also mean months, years, or forever away from the bright blue dot and the woman who baked bread and the sister who waved from a window. Later, when preparations began, the manager brought a small device and asked if Armin would send one message home before he left. Armin's fingers shook, but he spoke into the recorder with a clear voice. He said the words he had said before, but now with weight: "I am okay. Keep laughing." The manager promised to deliver the file back to the ship that watched Earth. Armin thought of leaving a note in a bottle that drifted across a wide sea. He walked to a small window and watched the blue dot grow small in the device's screen. He imagined the bakery and the bus stop and his sister's laugh. A team gathered at the ship's edge. They were workers who had seen him break rules and save lives. They were scientists who had learned from the creature. They were guards who had stood with him when alarms rang. They were not soldiers. They were ordinary hands who had decided that his way might help them be better. The ship folded space and the first team stepped into a field the size of a small town. Armin led them into bright wind and under an alien sky. The task was simple and dangerous: show how to tend small wounds, how to speak soft in a loud room, how to hold a hand when a child cries. He taught the teams to slow machines when a human pulse rose, to add a measure to their instruments that looked for the quiet fall of breath after a lullaby. At first they met suspicion. Some worlds recoiled at the idea that feelings might change law. Some rulers watched them like hawks. But small acts grew. A nurse learned to wrap a strip of cloth in a certain fold. A mechanic learned to stop a machine for a breath. A leader learned to listen. The work spread like small lights along a wire. Months passed and messages came back to the ship. They said the bridge liaison was changing things. They said human hands taught new safety. They said people who once feared strangers found their edges softened. But not all messages were gentle. One feed showed a fleet looking toward a bright blue dot with tools and questions. The image held a face with cold eyes that read hunger, not curiosity. Armin watched that feed and felt a chill. He thought of his sister and of home. He had power now. He could try to make rules that protected many. He could try to teach care as law. He could also make Earth known. He walked through the ship's corridor one night and heard the child singing the lullaby he had hummed at the warm creature. The notes traveled like a small lamp. Armin paused and let the sound fill him. He pressed his hand to the bridge badge and remembered the sandwich, the lamp blink, the city rain. He had been promoted on a lunch break, he had chosen to stay, and now he stood between worlds with a small song in his heart. The ship sailed toward the next system, and the question that rode with it was very old and very new. Could one human way of care change the choices of many, or would that same care make Earth a target for those who saw softness as an invitation? The lullaby ended and the ship hummed on.